Hello, everyone, and welcome to our show today, Why Zero Trust and Why Now, based on Osterman Research in-depth survey results. We'll go into a very quick housekeeping item just to make sure everybody's on the same page. You are all in listen-only mode. However, I definitely encourage you to ask questions by submitting any questions you may have for us in the questions panel of the webinar interface. Also, this session is going to be recorded, so if you have to step out or unable to listen to the whole thing, the recording will be sent out following today's event. So my name is Kim Johnson, VP of Product here at BioKey International. And as I said, welcome to today's discussion on why Zero Trust and why now. Today, I'm joined by Michael Sampson, Senior Analyst at Osterman Research, who conducted the research and authored the new white paper, Why Zero Trust is Important, which we'll be exploring today. Hi, Michael, and thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Kim. Thanks for the invitation to be here.
Great. And so I'm going to tee up the conversation a little bit, and then Michael will go into some of the results that we saw from the survey. But for everybody out there, today we're talking about zero trust. And zero trust is definitely one of the hotter buzzwords, I would say, out there. But it's all about offering a more modern approach for security and security framework to be able to meet modern work designs and tackle some of the cybersecurity challenges that all of you are facing today. We see things like the rise in remote work, the relentless waves of ransomware and other cyber attacks, and the need to redress fundamental weaknesses in what we've always called perimeter-based security. That's all coming together to really drive interest and uptake in zero trust architectures. Just so you know, first mentioned in 2004, so this is not a brand new concept, something that we've been talking about in 2004, revisited in 2010 by Forrester. Organizations are really progressing with zero trust design to increase the efficacy of cybersecurity protections and build a stronger foundation to address the new challenges of that hybrid work, data protection, and security that we're facing today. Organizations also, we've seen, view strengthening identity and access management as a key design modification, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that's key for zero trust initiatives, whether you're a small or large organization. And then confidential files and protection of important data is really the source of a lot of the zero trust interest in terms of what we're trying to protect. Overall, we're looking at a full deployment for most organizations within the next 2 years. So this webinar goes into the research, as I mentioned, and really we're going to be highlighting results from an in-depth survey that Osterman Research conducted. It's about 125 IT and security decision makers in mid-size and large organizations, which all knew about their zero trust architecture plans or whether or not their organization is planning to implement it. So what is zero trust, right? That's probably a good place to start, considering not everybody is as familiar with it. And really, the basic principle of zero trust is that no user or device is trusted by default. There's no inherited trust. Instead, every user or device is considered a potential threat until proven otherwise. So a lot of that never trust, always verify mentality that goes along with zero trust. And so being proven otherwise is not a one-time event. In other words, you don't gain access and then you're good to go to access everything else. The basic principle of zero trust is continually tested and enforced to limit the possibility that once somebody is trusted, they become compromised and then transition into an active threat status. That happens all the time. And so the real key word that I think of with zero trust is the continuous verification of that word continuous in general. Verification really happens in real time whenever a user or device requests access to new resources rather than periodically or over several days. So every time you're going in to request a new application access or new data access, those things are being re-verified. So whether it's a person or a device. And so zero trust and the principle of least privilege are tightly linked. That's definitely the words that go hand in hand. And so that only access privileges required for a given user or device are granted. So that also gets down to segmenting out who's accessing or what's accessing your data and applications and making sure they only have the amount of privilege that's required for what they're trying to access and what their role is. There's no super admins or lots of admins floating around. It really is only applicable to what they're trying to access. And so going into some of the research, the way we'll structure this is a couple questions to you, Michael, right? Giving some in-depth highlights about the research that's there. To everybody listening in, obviously the white paper is available attached to this webinar for full read if you'd like to go into it. But Michael, let's start with this one. What is driving the decision for organizations to embrace zero trust, and how is it expected to impact the efficiency of organizations' cybersecurity?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So this question, well, the chart in this slide is based on two different questions. It's always difficult from a research perspective to understand the impact of something looking backwards and saying, you know, like 2 years ago, what was it like? And then 1 year ago, what happened? Because people's memories kind of change or become dimmer over time. So we structured this question as, first of all, if you look at the current protections that you have without zero trust, how would you judge your efficacy in being able to achieve the following outcomes? 25% of respondents said that they felt highly confident or confident that their current protections, for example, could stop data breaches. 24% said we could prevent malicious insider attacks, and so on for all of the yellow bars on this chart. And then the next question in the survey was, assuming that you put zero trust in and it worked in terms of the scope of deployment that you were seeking, what would you expect? What's your expectation in terms of your cybersecurity posture efficacy at that point? And that's what the blue bars show. And there's a significant variation between where we are today and where organizations expect to be after zero trust is fully implemented within their environment. So the variation between the two is most significant for the stopping data breaches one, jumping from 25% overall efficacy to 60% overall efficacy. Preventing malicious insider attacks is the next largest change, and so on down here. So there's a number of them, as you can see, stopping threats from reaching people, meeting compliance requirements, preventing ransomware, and the others that are here.
Yeah, this is it's interesting, right? Because it looks almost like zero trust is the doubling of efficiency of cybersecurity, right? I think that's, or at least the confidence in our cybersecurity protections, which I find interesting, right? Zero trust is a framework, it's an architecture. The principles or the solutions, which we go into a little bit, aren't necessarily zero trust specific. Those are things you can put in today. And so that's the part I think that's interesting, right? The delta there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on one hand, there's sort of this, you know, the concern that perhaps organizations are expecting too much. You know, if you put something in and it doubles your efficacy in being able to stop data breaches, that's a high expectation going in. And this chart does not test the actual delivery of what zero trust can do, but rather the expectation of what should happen if zero trust is put in correctly. And I really like what you just said, that zero trust isn't a product or a solution that you buy. It's a series of things that fall under a particular guiding principle or framework or approach in order to strengthen the protections that we have. And we'll see this a bit later on in our conversation around budgeting, for example, that many of the things that currently are lumped in under a zero trust approach also have much wider benefits. So the identity management, access management, identity verification, yes, it has a tremendous role to play in zero trust, but it's not a zero trust initiative solely or exclusively.
Exactly. Yeah, it's explains why there's such hype around it, but too many eggs in the one term basket is kind of what I'm looking at here anyway, as to people thinking it will stop it. I guess the main takeaway though is that we're looking at zero trust as a way to reduce attacks, reduce breaches, malicious insiders. I mean, if you look across those
Yes.
things, essentially it's a reduction of threats and attacks. And so
I mean, the other comment that's good to make is that while Zero Trust offers a significant uplift across each of those things, no one is expecting it to deliver 100, or not everyone is expecting it to deliver 100% efficacy. And I think that's a healthy place to be. It's not the one silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, but it makes a significant contribution as a framework and as a way of thinking about security to deal with the types of attacks and threats that organizations are facing.
Exactly. Yep. No, that's a great point. I don't think there is any silver bullet in cybersecurity, right? I think we would have done it hopefully if there was one. But this is leading its way to best practices and better controls is how I think of this. And so,
Sure.
Looking into the kind of next question we had discussed and some of the research touched upon is which cybersecurity protections, right? You just touched upon one of them, but what cybersecurity protections are organizations focused on in terms of redesigning to meet some of the zero trust requirements or to support their adoption of zero trust?
Well, identity and access management for internal people, employees, was the design factor that received the highest level of this is really important to us, or this is what we're focusing on at the moment, with 73% of respondents saying this is the key issue for us. And then application access management came in second at 60%. And then there's a couple of items that repeat those same two ideas, but for external participants like customers or supply chain partners. And then at the bottom of the chart are two issues around data classification and how data management is handled within an organization. But at the top of the chart, getting identity and access management right is the critical issue.
Mm-hmm. And both those components, right? We see people that have some access management. They haven't really nailed down how to create secure identities. How do you use those identities across multiple areas? And again, I think that continuous, component. It's one thing to do IAM, as in even just username and password. You could technically say as an identity and access management control, but is that enough? And does that meet the requirements of zero trust? And I think, like you said here, it's focused on design modifications. So what you have in place today probably isn't enough to meet the zero trust requirements or reach a true zero trust environment.
And I think, well, I hope that anyone who is in cybersecurity is very aware that just relying on usernames and passwords for access to anything is at the very weak end of securing and verifying identities.
Mm-hmm.
The proliferation of data breaches of that type of data, the use of brute force password attacks to be able to infiltrate systems from other places, even just users clicking remember these details and don't ask me again when they sign in, and if they lose a device that is ill secured, then someone else is able to assume their identity for access through to that system. So the more that we can strengthen the approach that is taken to identity and verification and who is allowed to do what and what is the scope of access that someone should be given, I think are really important aspects of becoming a zero trust organization in terms of how you think about this. So items like unified identity across different systems, the use of multi-factor authentication to make it more difficult to sign in beyond just using a username and password, the use of biometrics that adds this layer of there probably aren't that many people in the world with your fingerprint, for example, or your face. And so just shrinking the scope of what is possible for people to do in order to secure no, I didn't say that right, sorry. Shrinking the scope of what a cyber criminal is able to do based on compromising just the username password is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I'd like to say your hope is met, that username and password, we've gotten beyond it. I think we know we haven't. But there is better ways. And I think that's part of the redesign, hopefully, that Zero Trust, adds gasoline to kind of that fire of innovation and figuring out better ways. And it's good to see the application access management in the sense that we aren't thinking about perimeters or castle walls anymore, right? How do you tie access to what they're accessing, whether it's the data or the application itself? And so we've seen a lot of transition there, that it's not just about getting keys to the front door and then you're in every room of the house, right? It's about understanding whether you're allowed to go into the kitchen and what's in the kitchen once you're inside the house. So I think that's been a big shift, and it's good to see that the priorities are there. I am surprised to see data participation lower.
Yeah, and even in some cases, once you're in the kitchen, which drawers are you allowed to open, and which utensils and which drawers are you allowed to use?
Right.
And I remember back in the mid-90s working on a particular software application and building products for people based on that. And we had this huge level of access. We had this access matrix that we were able to use to say who's allowed into the system overall, which is kind of the perimeter to the system. But then every single application in that, who's allowed in here, what's their level of right. And then if you wanted to get very specific to every single item in that application, who can access it, who can edit it, who can see the items within that particular thing. And we need more of that thinking going forward across the other applications that we have. I guess one of the other, I was thinking of this yesterday in preparation for our call. I remember being in a conference, must have been in the early 2000s, I guess, and the person was from a hospital, and they were talking about the access management approach that they had taken, and they said that a patient record is locked all of the time, apart from the hours or the time frame in which a active patient appointment is in place. No one can access it unless these other things are in place. And it just struck me as a really clever way of protecting the data in healthcare systems. I think there's been some fundamental thinking that's happened years ago, and we're seeing more organizations pick this up and strengthen the way that they approach these issues. You were saying something about data which concerned both of us. You want to say that again?
Yeah, just that I was surprised that data like classification and flow management is actually on the bottom. To me, knowing what type of data you have and where it is and what, level of access people should have to it, I would think actually should go closer to the top, and is an area I've seen organizations struggle with more than, let's say, some of the IAM challenges that we help solve. So I'm actually surprised by that it's lower, unless maybe it's an area that people do feel they have a significant handle on.
Or perhaps it's just a life cycle into Zero Trust that we're seeing in here, because many of the organizations that were in the survey were still in the fairly early days of the Zero Trust implementation. And so perhaps, if we put on the best interpretation of this chart that we can do, organizations are signaling that a key thing that they're focusing on at the moment is strengthening identity and access management to applications, sort of at this higher level rather than specific data elements within that. And the importance, once those issues are resolved and addressed and dealt with, and a better foundation is in place beyond just username and password or assumed security of an individual and a device, then the ability and the scope and the scale to then focus on things like data flow management, data classification, which are fundamental underpinnings to be able to trigger the right microsegmentation policy, are issues that will become more important over time. That's the best spin that I can put on it.
Yeah, so you're looking at it more as a maturity of adoption and the immediate, like we said, zero trust doesn't happen overnight, right? There's definitely steps they're going to need to take to get there. That makes more sense. But essentially, these are some of the first foundational steps. Organizations may not be at the point where they're ready to go into the micro spaces, like you said, into the kitchen drawer, getting the utensils. That makes sense. Okay. And so I guess the other question, we've talked about kind of why and what's driving the decision. We've seen a lot around attacks, ransomware, worried about cyber threat. What are the modifications organizations are making? The next question that we had really was on how broadly are organizations planning on deploying zero trust. And I know, Michael, the research segmented it a few different ways on company size and other things, but how about just, this is talking about the scope. Explain a little bit about what you saw here in terms of the results of the survey.
I think you and I had an argument about how to, excuse me, ask this question because
we did, yeah,
we did. Because we went into the research making the assumption that everyone would say, or most people would say, we're doing enterprise-wide deployment. And in the design of the survey, we went with a more nuanced question, which was, are you focused on this at an enterprise-wide level? And we were happy for everyone to say yes to that. Or is it something less than enterprise entire? So 65% of the respondents said they were focusing enterprise-wide in terms of their deployment scope, 15% one or more business units only, and then 25% specific departments only, or for use by specific or by selected groups of users only. Overall, 8% said that they were not planning on deploying a zero trust architecture. So in terms of the enterprise-wide, 65%, great. Let's just leave that to one side for the time being. This other 25% that are doing something less than enterprise-wide, again, my best interpretation of this is that it's a maturity model or a maturity of adoption, like we talked about on the previous slide. And these are initial tests. These are initial experimentation. This is a on the ground, does this actually deliver the benefits that we are expecting? And is this something that we can pull off? Or, and if it is, then we'll push to enterprise-wide later on, but let's at least start somewhere and safeguard some of the critical data, assets, and jewels that we have within the organization.
Yeah, it is we did go back and forth on this. And I'm happy to see the data like this, actually, that the ideal state is enterprise-wide, right? I mean, to do true zero trust, never trust, always verify, no users and devices accessing, et cetera.
Sure.
It has to be enterprise-wide. So it is a trick question in that sense, but I agree with you. Either it's a maturity thing, could be resources too, right? That's where I've seen it, where, all right, we want to do it, but we can't roll it out everywhere due to the resources we have. So it'd be interesting to lay this over time, to see if there was a different planned scope of deployment. Michael, just to put you on the spot a little bit, if you remember, was there a difference in terms of the scope with a larger organization versus a smaller organization? I believe that was part of it, or maybe that was time frame, which we're going to get into in just a minute.
Yeah, look, if I just look quickly back at the report, I think that what we saw was that organizations planning to do a full deployment versus organizations planning to do less than a full deployment, they both expected about the same deployment time frame for that. So only going with a business unit, for example, rather than enterprise-wide, didn't seem to make that much of a difference in terms of how long it was expected to take. And I mean, the question about larger organizations, I looked at organizations of over 1,000 employees, and they expected to be able to deploy faster than organizations with fewer employees. And obviously, or usually what we see, not obviously, that's not the right way to say it, but usually what we see with larger organizations is that they have access to better internal resourcing and more people to deal with the changes that are required. And also sometimes there's higher urgency for those organizations due to reputational and financial damage that happens when a data breach occurs or they get compromised through a ransomware attack or something like that.
So they'd have more incentive to go enterprise-wide and reduce the risk is essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's a good word. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And yeah, I can't tell if these are realistic expectations or optimistic ones, especially if it takes all the same time to implement. But that's always left open for interpretation. But I do think it's interesting. Enterprise-wide, you thought would be at the 100%, and we are seeing some deviations there.
Yeah. And the comment that we made in the paper was, and I'll just quote it because I think it says it quite well, creating threat susceptibility by safeguarding less than 100% of the organization with zero trust protections is not a strong cybersecurity strategy.
Correct.
So
correct.
For the 65% of organizations that are taking this approach, good job, keep going. For those who are doing something less than that, good job, thanks for starting the journey, but we look forward to seeing you do more than that over time.
Right. And I think that's gone with security. Multi-factor is a great example of that. We put multi-factor authentication on our privileged accounts and remote access, or VPN, right? Apply it everywhere to all accounts. And so we're getting to the point now with the attacks we're facing, the weaknesses that hackers can go after, doing the insurance policy approach of like, where's the risk? And that's the only places I'm going to apply things. It's just not, like you said, it's not a comprehensive or holistic cybersecurity strategy at this point. And so, Michael, going into kind of what we had started to talk about was really looking at how, what's a priority on deploying and how long is it expected to take. I've seen here a couple stats just from the paper, 51% have it as a top 5 priority. And then 2 out of 3 organizations have achieved full deployment of zero trust, ranging from 3 months to 2 years. Any other color here you can provide from the research in terms of prioritization of it, or how long it's expected to take?
In terms of priority, you've bundled in that 51%. That 51% is made up of 2 different data points. So 8% of the respondents said that it was the number 1 priority for their organization. So that's a promising thing to see. And then another 43% said it was priority number 2, 3, 4, or 5 for their organization. And I guess if we looked back at that first slide when we considered around the uplift in overall cybersecurity posture efficacy, it's no wonder that it's such a high priority if on average we're expecting that it will double a range of protections against a range of significant threats that we are facing. This question is one that we as Osterman Research have asked quite often this year across different surveys. And some of the other issues that have come up as top 5 priorities are very much aligned with a zero trust agenda. Things like the ability to discover sensitive data within an organization as a top 5 priority from another survey, which very much aligns with zero trust. The ability to prevent data exfiltration as another top 5 priority that from a different survey that very much aligns with this. We did not ask why it was not a top priority, and we did not ask the reasons why firms were not deploying. But yes, as you have said, 51% said it was a top 5, another 33% said that it was priority number 6 through 10, and overall 16% said that it was not a top priority for them.
Yeah, and I think your point also, so zero trust has become, like I said, the buzzword, right? It's the new framework. It's architected now by NIST out there. You can go implement, right? So it's become definitely a highlight to many cybersecurity programs and organizations looking to do that. I wonder, part of it too is I think it's still a little misunderstood. As we highlighted, it is an architecture, it's a framework, it's not a solution or a product or a single answer. And so it is good to hear that regardless of zero trust being top priority, you are seeing other things that indicate trying to reach that same goal as top priorities throughout your surveys. I find that very interesting and have seen that also with the focus on some of the foundational elements like multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, other things that are used to start building these building blocks of this framework.
Yes. And Kim, you and I talked last month about cybersecurity in government, and I was just thinking when you were talking about the wider push around zero trust, that was one of the items that was in President Biden's presidential order in executive order in May around cybersecurity in government and cybersecurity more widely across the nation to protect the United States against the threats that it's seen. So it's definitely something that is higher on the agenda as a way of dealing with the threats and risks that organizations are facing now.
Right. Yeah, I think, and that's a great highlight to have an executive order come out, explicitly say zero trust is what you need to go forward with, is excellent. I do think there's probably a number of government agencies as well as organizations that are now saying, okay, well, how do we do that? Right. I think that's pretty standard in a lot of the frameworks, a lot of the architectures we see come out. There's no secret recipe to then achieving it. And so now the questions are coming up of how do you implement that? How do you implement it that quickly? And like we've highlighted, there are definitely dedicated solutions or things that you start building the foundations of to get there. But that's a great point. Yeah, even our government here in the United States, right, is essentially mandating government agencies to use it and to implement it.
Yes.
So.
Yes. I was just thinking of Thomas Edison's comment that, something about 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Now, if the executive order gives the 1% inspiration, organizations still have to do the 99% perspiration in order to transition that from great idea, we need to do this, through to this is something that's in place that is rock solid for us. We've looked at everything, we've secured everything, we've put in the right level of policies, we've tested it, we've educated employees, we've got executives on board, etc., etc. We've lined everything up, and we're in a much better place than we were 18 months, 2 years ago, because of this framework and this point of inspiration that the executive order has given us.
Right. Yep. No, I think that's a great quote. I would definitely back that statement up, that it's probably causing the 99% quite a bit of perspiration. I remember kind of the evolution of this from the perimeter-based security, right, to just a few years ago, I was having conversations about how do you establish a level of trust across your organization? How do you know when things are trusted? And then be able to use that as your norm to say, this isn't a trusted entity anymore. And it's now gone to the point where you really can't do that. You can't trust something implicitly based on characteristics or anything else, just based on the sophistication of attack and sophistication of your environment. And I also think organizations that are sweating it out don't know their environments, right? That's the hardest part about this, is knowing what are your assets, who are your users, what are the devices, and being able to control those tends to be the bigger challenge for any cybersecurity program, and is especially challenging for zero trust if you have to get down to that micro segmentation of policies and controls. So I would say the work to get here and the journey that it takes to get to zero trust is definitely going to be a constant battle that organizations are fighting.
Yes, I was just thinking back on a briefing call we had earlier this year with a vendor out of Israel, I think it was, and they highlighted some of the device threats that organizations were facing, like manufacturers who deliver, or maybe not manufacturers, but cyber criminals who set up interceptions in supply chain for mice and other external peripherals, and then add malicious elements into that for unauthorized data access. And so you get, this delivery of mice from your manufacturer, you put them out across all of the desktops, and they start exfiltrating data. And so it becomes this massive job to identify
okay, now we have these principles in place. Where are the weak points that we have that are now delivering and introducing new points of susceptibility to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how do you know that, right? I had the same case when I was working in healthcare. I am of a hospital that plugged in the new medicine cabinet that had not been updated and contained basically malware. And so, you know, how do you predict that? And that's when you have to you're not just going to plug that into your production environment, right? You have to have those checks and balances set up. And the devices are becoming even more challenging, right? Everybody's talking about IoT, but actually controlling that access, especially with devices that don't have a lot of computing power, how do you do that? And how do you do that effectively? Has become a big challenge, and a big challenge for industries like utility companies and others that aren't necessarily the best equipped or has the most modern infrastructure to do that. So I think the devices and that's probably a whole nother research topic, right? But the device access, device control, knowing at manufacturing, this is the device that says it is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, I think actually just remembering the other scenario that they painted was, cleaning staff come in where you've got a bad actor in the cleaning staff, and as they're going around the financial floor, they're swapping out clean mice with a dirty mouse that then enables bad actors to get access to things that they shouldn't have. And so it becomes this end-to-end way of thinking about and approaching what is going on for us as an organization.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And not implicitly trusting those just because they're on somebody's desk, right? I think
absolutely sure.
Yeah. Michael, and then so looking at kind of the last piece that came out of this, which I find just as fascinating, is kind of then how much budget is being allocated towards deploying zero trust. And then also, what are some of the big barriers that you saw or the research pointed out from people not being able to be successful? What are those blockers for them? Let's start with budget. How would we interpret this chart? What are we kind of seeing in terms of budget allocation for zero trust?
So the survey asked the question as, how much are you budgeting this year? How much are you budgeting next year? How much are you budgeting the year after? And then I ran the numbers to work out what the percentage variation between all of those items were. But one thing that you can see is that when you look at the no budget options, the number of organizations who are saying we haven't budgeted anything is declining from 16% this year to 9% next year to 6% the year after. So fewer organizations are budgeting nothing over the next few years.
Mm-hmm.
You can also see that same trend in we're budgeting between 1 and 10% of our overall IT budget to zero trust. That also is dropping from 52% to 46% to 45%. But the next three represent the areas of increased growth. So the percentage of organizations that are allocating between 11 and 20% is increasing from 16% to 25% and then declining slightly to 22%. Those that are budgeting between 21% and 30% is increasing from 7 to 9 to 14%. Those budgeting between 31 to 40% is growing from 3 to 5 to 7%. So more organizations are intending on budgeting more against or allocating more of their budget against zero trust initiatives. And this is where my comment earlier on came was thinking about, is that because zero trust isn't just a thing that you do that has only benefits within a zero trust concept, the ways that we strengthen identity, the ways that we strengthen application access for internal people, the ways that we do design modifications to improve how customers and supply chain partners work with our systems, the way that we do data classification, all of those absolutely have benefits within a zero trust agenda, but they also have much wider benefits across the organization. So my comment within the paper and what I was wondering about is whether there's just a reallocation of some of the programs or initiatives that these fundamental items are sitting underneath that's being reflected in these higher numbers.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. It says zero trust initiatives, but zero trust initiatives is a broad umbrella, I guess is the point there, right?
Absolutely.
Not just,
Yeah, sure.
I think if you put zero trust as a high level category, a lot of a cybersecurity budget would fall into that bucket, is what we're seeing. But that's still a significant amount. I mean,
Sure.
you're looking on average,
It's a significant amount.
yeah, 20 to 40% roughly, right? On average, people are starting to apply of their total IT budget, not just their cybersecurity budget. So that's a significant investment from what I can see. And then, Michael,
Yeah, I agree.
how about barriers? I know part of the paper also looked at what's keeping organizations from being able to do this successfully. Any highlights there in terms of the data that came out of the survey?
We asked the respondents to rate a series of barriers. I think it was about 12 or something of them, 12 potential barriers. The one that was most significant was dealing with limitations in legacy systems. 55% of respondents said that that barrier was highly or extremely significant in their work. And where you have legacy systems that don't allow microsegmentation policies within a zero trust framework to work, because they just don't have those design constructs
or API calls in place in order to say, no, you can't do that because you're such and such a person coming in at this time of day using a device with this characteristic. Then that becomes a barrier to say, well, what do we now do? And for organizations, in some cases, you can upgrade legacy applications. In other cases, you either have to firewall that off and deal with that differently, or look at doing a migration to a modern platform to be able to do that. And if that's what you decide, that becomes a much bigger piece of work and program that has to be dealt with. There were also issues around obtaining the appropriate resources, people, and funding. Respondents also said that it demands a significant rethink in how we approach this. And there were some other issues that all seemed to me to be barriers that were reflective of the early days of zero trust. How do we deal with our legacy systems? How do we get enough resources? The least ranked barrier, I believe, will become the most critical one over time as organizations transition to a more mature state. And that was zero trust can decrease employee productivity when microsegmentation policies are incorrect. And only 25% of respondents said that this was a highly or extremely significant barrier to them currently. But my assertion is that if we were to run the survey again in 2 or 3 years, that we would see that this issue would become a much bigger issue. You know, if you've got a business group that's trying to get access to a sanctioned system and it doesn't work because of the restrictive microsegmentation policies that have been put in place, then that business group's just going to say, well, let's just go and do our own thing, and we'll spin up our own instance of Salesforce or whatever it is that's not connected to our organization. We'll use that, and you've then fundamentally lost the war, because you now have data and access to systems that's not being controlled, that's not working within the security policy framework that is in place.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, right? So the top things, what it shows me is the top things are more of the IT decision makers issues today, like you said, right? Like, so integrating legacy, do I have resources? How do I think about security differently, right? Is a very kind of internal IT security thoughts. The more pressing things, I agree with you, are at the bottom of this, which are the handling people that want to be the exception to the policy, or getting senior managers and the board to cooperate. Those are usually the outcomes that kind of hit IT folks in the head, unfortunately, after a deployment or after they've constructed the best, security kind of program and structure, and probably the hardest things to overcome. So I agree. It shows a little bit, again, of that maturity level of adoption implementation. Seems like we're at the brass tacks of how do I think about security differently? How do I implement it with the systems I have? And then some of the barriers, which probably, like you said, ask them a year into deployment, would most likely be those people outcomes of policy acceptance and productivity. But it's flipped on its head, or it's presenting the data with the time frame people have in mind on what's going to happen.
Yes.
So.
Yes, and building on what you've just said, Kim, I think somewhere in the paper I say something to the effect of, if you have a zero trust deployment that works perfectly technically but fails organizationally, then your deployment has failed.
Yes.
And so, all of these people issues are critical to take into consideration and design around from the earliest steps and stages of a zero trust initiative.
Right. Yeah. Security is only as good as it is adopted, right, and used. And so you got to think about all the pieces. It can't be the last barrier I'm worried about is employee productivity. Should probably be one of the first priorities to address. Because it will put a project dead in the water if it's unable to move forward or unable to be adopted. So fascinating data. I mean, I think it definitely shows where people are at. I've heard more often than not from IT security professionals, I have to really rethink how I think about security. And
Yes.
That's, like you said, I would encourage people to go out and go start talking to their users, understanding how people interact with their business. What do they need to be successful? It's kind of like any good marketing campaign, even, right? Who's your audience? What do they care about? What's their pain points? Those actually apply a lot to security. And how do you make sure that it's effective for everybody that's having to adopt it? So,
yes,
point.
Yes.
And then, so the last thing, we're going to wrap up with tons of research in the white paper, as mentioned, but the white paper always does a great job of also recommending some solutions and types of solutions, as we mentioned, to help support zero trust and help making it work for organizations. All of these listed here are essential. The one that I wanted to highlight was the continuous verification of identity. We've talked about it quite a bit today. It is the foundational element to really any zero trust framework. And that the key is really that the implementation of that verification, or what we think of as even authentication, is that it's continuous. Without that, really unauthorized access may be allowed. Something that's trusted, I've heard of people saying, I do multi-factor to the desktop, and then if it's a trusted device, they can get into anything, right? And those are the gaps, those are the issues with some of that mentality of once trusted, it can get, the person or the device can access anything. So we see organizations really looking towards solutions that have stronger multi-factor authentication, single sign-on to reduce the number of passwords and the areas for potential sharing of credentials and other bad practices. And then approaches like contextual authentication that brings in context around the user as they're logging in, and also step-up authentication. So as someone's accessing another application or accessing another data file, it's revalidating or authenticating them to say, are you privileged? Do you have the right role to be able to access this? If not, we'll either block it or provide additional authentication factors. Also, biometric authentication methods, which are bound to the identity of the user, is really the highest level of integrity that you can get in terms of authentication, versus something like just the user's phone or token is present being enough to really verify they are who they say they are. And so ultimately, stronger authentication, like we said, beyond a username and password, must be applied to 100% of accounts 100% of the time to even start declaring you're on your first steps to that zero trust rollout and it being successful. Other solutions you can see here, some of them replacing top-level admin access rights with tighter controls, detecting characteristics in devices, networks, and geographical locations, and then mitigating some of those limitations like we talked about in legacy applications is going to be even more important. All right, so that wraps up our conversation for today. As mentioned, you can download the full white paper by visiting bio-key.com. It's also attached to this presentation, so if you want to download it directly from Bright Talk. And it really goes into a lot of detail around solutions to successfully implement zero trust, and also just a lot of the findings from the survey on the adoption of, barriers to, right, what people are trying to achieve with zero trust implementations. So I'll wrap it up there. That's really all the time we have for now. Thank you again, Michael, so much for joining me, providing the deeper dive into zero trust and why it is important for organizations to consider for their security programs.
Thanks for having me, Kim.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. And thank you to everyone listening in. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks so much.